A true story explaining schizophrenia. The Day the Voices started Episode 1, The Perfect World. 1 in every 100 human beings on this planet will develop schizophrenia. Most of them are young. Most of them are completely normal, right up until the moment they are not. Boston, Massachusetts. One of the most educated, most accomplished cities in the United States. A city of Nobel laureates, neurosurgeons, and software architects. A city that has long believed it can solve any problem with enough intelligence. And on a residential street in Brookline, in a brownstone apartment on Beacon Street, lived a young man who embodied everything this city stood for. His name was Daniel Carter, 25 years old, 6'1", dark hair, sharp eyes, and a quiet confidence that made strangers assume he was the smartest person in any room he entered. And they were usually right. Daniel had just completed his computer science degree at MIT, graduating in the top 3% of his class. He had been accepted into a highly competitive graduate research program in artificial intelligence. His thesis advisor described him as one of the most naturally gifted students he had supervised in 20 years. He had two close friends, Aiden, a neurology resident at Massachusetts General Hospital, and Priya, a biomedical engineer. Every Thursday evening they met at a coffee shop on Commonwealth Avenue and argued about everything from quantum computing to the best pizza in the North End. His father was a partner at a Boston law firm. His mother was a professor of biochemistry at Tufts University. They were proud in the way that parents are proud when they believe they have done everything right. They had no idea that inside Daniel's brain, at that very moment, in that very apartment, behind those very sharp and confident eyes, a biological process had already quietly begun. A process that had no symptoms yet, no name, no face, but it was there, and it was patient. Episode 2, The First Crack. It began in late October, 8 months before Daniel's eventual diagnosis. And like all truly dangerous things, it began softly. The first thing Daniel noticed was sleep. Not insomnia, but something stranger. He would lie in bed, and his mind would not produce rest. It produced questions, circular, looping questions that returned to the same point again and again without resolution. Why had his professor paused before answering his question in Tuesday's seminar? Was there something behind that pause? Why had Aiden seemed distracted at coffee last Thursday? Was he uncomfortable with something? These were not obsessive thoughts. Not anxiety in any form Daniel recognized. They felt like insight, like a sharper than usual attention to detail that his analytical mind had simply decided to apply to human behavior. He told himself he was noticing things other people missed. What he did not know, what no one told him because no one knew, was that deep inside his brain, in the structures of his limbic system, his dopaminergic circuits were beginning to dysregulate. The ventral striatum, the brain's reward and significance center, was beginning to hyperactivate in response to neutral, irrelevant stimuli. His brain was learning to mark ordinary events as deeply meaningful, urgent, and personally significant. This is not a metaphor. This is measurable neurobiology. PET scan studies published in The Lancet can detect this exact dopamine surge in the striatum months Before the first psychotic episode ever arrives, by November, Daniel had stopped his morning runs. The streets had started to feel different. Not dangerous, just observed. People on the sidewalk seemed to hold their gaze on him a fraction of a second too long. A man in a grey coat appeared on his commute 3 days in a row. Obviously a coincidence. Daniel knew it was a coincidence, but he began taking a different route. His mother called on Sunday. He told her he was fine, just heads down on the thesis. She accepted this. Brilliant, driven young men were allowed to be focused. What she could not know was that her son was standing at the edge of a cliff he could not yet see. And every day, the ground beneath him was giving way by millimeters. Episode 3, to 17 a.m., December 14th, to 17 in the morning. Boston. Daniel was 3 minutes from sleep. There was a sound. Not a loud sound. Not a crash. Not a shout. Something quieter. And because of that, something far more impossible to dismiss. Someone had said his name. A man's voice. Clear. Low. Positioned. And he was absolutely certain of this. Somewhere near the window. He sat up. He turned on the bedside lamp. The room was exactly as it always was. His desk, his monitors, his jacket on the chair. No one. He checked the closet, the bathroom, the hallway, every room, and found nothing. He checked the window, the fire escape below, the street, a taxi moving slowly. Nothing. He checked his phone. No calls. He stood in the kitchen for 6 minutes, listening to absolute silence. Then he did what any rational person does when they hear an inexplicable sound in an empty apartment. At 2 in the morning, he convinced himself it was a dream, or the building, or a neighbor's television through the walls. He went back to bed. He did not sleep again that night. Here is what was actually happening inside Daniel's brain at that moment. And this is not speculation. This is confirmed neuroscience from imaging studies published in journals, including Nature Reviews Neuroscience and Science. In schizophrenia, Broca's area, the brain's speech production center, and Wernicke's area, the brain's speech comprehension center, activate simultaneously. The brain generates internal speech, and then it fails to tag that speech as self-generated. So the patient hears a voice, externally located, real, and clear, because to their auditory cortex, it is real. The activation is neurologically identical to hearing an actual person speak. Daniel was not imagining anything. His brain had generated a sound and presented it to him as something that came from outside. There is no rational, intelligent, or educated way for a person in that situation to know that what they heard did not happen. The voice returned on the 15th and the 16th. By December 21st, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, it was coming every night, and it had begun to have something to say. It told him, in a tone that was neither hostile nor friendly, simply factual, that people were aware of him, that his movements were being logged, that his graduate program had been designed specifically to observe him. Daniel did not believe it, not yet, but he found that he could not stop thinking about it. Episode for the Architecture of Lies. January arrived, and Daniel's mind began doing something extraordinary and catastrophic. It began constructing, on his corkboard, What had once held only thesis notes, new items began to appear. Printed articles, a map of Boston with certain locations circled, 3 different colored strings connecting points that only Daniel understood. He had identified what he believed was a pattern, not a delusion. He would have laughed at that word, but a genuine, verifiable, methodical pattern of surveillance that his training in data analysis uniquely positioned him to detect. The same black Suburban parked on different streets within a 2-mile radius of his apartment. 3 times in 8 days, an email from his thesis advisor rescheduling a meeting at the exact same hour. His neighbor's apartment received an unannounced visitor. Coincidence? Daniel had run the statistics. The probability of these correlations occurring randomly was, by his calculations, less than 4%. He was wrong. His statistics were constructed from a biased dataset, built entirely from connections his damaged brain had already decided were meaningful. He was not analyzing reality. He was decorating a conclusion he had already reached. This is the neurobiology of delusion, and it is important to understand it precisely. Delusions are not a failure of intelligence. They are not a failure of education or logic. The prefrontal cortex, which normally reality checks incoming signals through error monitoring, shows significantly reduced gray matter and reduced activity in schizophrenia, and so a to-hit failure occurs. First, the overactive dopamine system assigns excessive significance to random events. Second, the underactive prefrontal cortex fails to correct the false belief. Together, these produce an unshakable conviction that feels, from the inside, more rational and more real than anything anyone on the outside could possibly say. Research published in Nature Review's Neuroscience confirms that arguing against a delusion activates the brain's conflict response, actually strengthening the belief through a confirmation bias loop. The harder someone pushes against the wall, the more solid the wall becomes. He mentioned the black Suburban to Aiden, just once, framed carefully as an observation. Aiden, a neurology resident who had already seen patients in the early stages of psychosis, felt something cold pass through him. He chose his words very carefully. He said, "Daniel, have you been sleeping okay?" Daniel nodded, calmly and certainly. He said he was sleeping fine. Aiden walked home that evening and called his attending physician. He said, "I think my friend might be having a first episode." Aiden was right, but Daniel was so completely convinced by the architecture of his own delusions that he would not accept help for more months. For months in which the building in his mind grew taller, more elaborate, and more unassailable. The average delay between the onset of psychotic symptoms and first psychiatric treatment is 74 weeks. 74 weeks. That is nearly a year and a half of a human brain receiving no intervention. While the illness progresses, research published in the Archives of General Psychiatry confirmed that this delay is associated with significantly worse outcomes across every measurable dimension: cognitive function, social recovery, and long-term remission. Every week without treatment is a week the brain loses.